started. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Oh, I already jumped ahead. Welcome to Experiential Marketing Unleashed. I'm here with Karen Brunke. I'm Greg Klingeman. I'm trying to fix my screen because I've got some stuff in the way. Hold on a second here. Strategies and best practices for engaging your audiences. Okay, here we go. A couple housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be distributed to all registrants shortly following the conclusion of the webinar. If you have questions, and I hope you do, there will be a live Q&A following the webinar content, and you can enter your questions directly into the Zoom Q&A. Okay, here we go. Hey, I'm going to quickly just talk a little bit about AnyRoad so that you understand. We do a lot of these webinars. I've done a couple myself, but important to kind of give you a sense of where we come from at AnyRoad. You see a couple of the brands who we work with. We're the leading experiential marketing platform, and we enable businesses to operate and optimize their events, tours, classes, activations, and field marketing to grow consumer brand loyalty and drive greater ROI from their guest experiences. So we are working with over 200 customers across 90 countries, managing and measuring the impact of over 200,000 experiences and events every month, over 15 million data points collected annually, and we help our clients to achieve a significant Net Promoter Score NPS increase. Quick introductions. I'm Greg Klingeman. I'm AnyRoad's VP of Strategy and Field Operations for EMEA. I joined AnyRoad last year from Diageo, where I was Global Retail Director. So I was involved in a lot of experiential marketing activities. I architected and led a big investment program in Scotland around Scotch whiskey experiences, transforming 14 distillery visitor centers into best-in-class brand experiences and creating something called Johnny Walker Princes Street in Edinburgh, which is a 20+ award-winning brand home covering 8 floors with rooftop bars and tours and retail and event space and cast maturing in the basement. And my background prior to that was in retail operations, strategy, and omnichannel. I'll turn it over to Karen. We've known each other a couple years now and finally had a chance to meet in person for the first time about a month ago in Edinburgh at Johnny Walker Princes Street. Over to you, Karen.
Oh, Greg, thank you. It is so good to see you again. And what a remarkable experience we had at Johnny Walker Princes Street. What a great example of a just wondrous experience. Thank you for this marvelous invitation to join you and AnyRoad. And my goodness, this awe-inspiring group of guests from around the globe that have joined today. It's just a moment that I'm looking forward to spending with you all today. For me, as I also reflect back on my experience, I've had just this moment of gratitude to reflect on some remarkable experiences that I've had with leading brands across food service and hospitality, across consumer packaged goods, retail, brand homes, entertainment destinations, placemaking, and more. Most notably, my experience was rooted in 21 years with the Coca-Cola company, and 11 of that was leading the global brand marketing, sales, and events for the World of Coca-Cola, the brand home and attraction in Atlanta, Georgia. In 2020, I founded StoryMap Marketing, a niche destination marketing consultancy that's really dedicated to helping endear people to places that helps make them more. That's a little bit about me.
Fantastic. Thank you for that background. And we're excited to have you here, Karen. In a sense, recreating some of what you talked about in Edinburgh to a broader audience and a different audience. So excited to hear what you have to talk about today.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, let's talk a little bit about experiential marketing and kind of maybe a little bit around definitions. And, you know, we talk a bit, particularly in AnyRoad, we talk about kind of 2 main forms of experiential marketing: brand activations and brand homes. Some people call them brand houses, visitor centers, whatever it may be. And a lot of the way we look at experiential marketing historically is that it's been elusive in terms of capturing data and measuring the impact. And so a lot of what we do is, for example, to give the experiential marketer the same kind of toolkit as the digital marketer, and basically balance the art and the science around it. And I know you probably have a couple of things you wanted to talk about around brand activations versus brand homes and kind of how they're different and how they bring different things to the table in an overall brand marketing strategy.
Absolutely. Well, I know that this is a topic that we have a shared passion around, and I just love also what you just shared. It's experiential marketing is an art and a science. And maybe building upon that, before we kind of dive a little deeper into experiential marketing, I thought that there could be some value in us framing that definition of experiential marketing by taking just a quick moment to touch on the human experience. And so just let's think about this for a moment. So we as humans are all on this transformational journey in this thing called life, right? You were trying to figure out who we are and become who we are intended to be through these moments, through whether they're milestone moments or they may be these little micro moments that we encounter in our everyday lives. And each moment in our lives has meaning. They have emotion, and they, have an impact not only on our lives, but also in the lives of other people. I love the bumper sticker and the movement that Zach Horvath has created. You may have seen it, Live a Great Story. And I love it because I really truly believe that we are all here to live a great story, or we're here to live this life worth remembering. And so kind of behind the heart of this idea, as we think about, this journey that we're all on, we all want to go through places or to places, to events. We're journeying through relationships. Yet there's also this idea that we all want to be taken somewhere. And I'll build on this a little bit throughout our conversation today, but this idea that we want to be transported through our story, into our story, ultimately to make these moments matter more. So I just wanted to kind of really think about the foundation of experiential marketing is also touching on, who we are as humans and that human experience. And I share this because these were many fundamental foundations of experiential marketing throughout my career. And I also think, as we as marketers, experiential marketers, event planners, agencies, distilleries, brand homes, content creators, and more, right? How can we take this responsibility and this privilege that we really are given to be the guide for guiding consumers through these experiences that activate the heart, activate the senses, activate the mind, and ultimately, building. And I think what you all do just such a fantastic job of measuring is then this bond that we can create between brands and consumers that leads to this enduring relationship. And also helps you achieve those business objectives that you may have in mind.
Yeah. I mean, definitely great brand building assets. I know the next slide we'll talk a little bit about kind of some of the differences and impact on brand. And yeah, I mean, these are things, experiential marketing. I think you touched on this idea of storytelling leading to emotional connection, which of course, from a brand perspective also means leading into future purchase behavior and loyalty and those things that we're all trying to achieve when we're investing in activations and brand homes.
Yeah, I just really admire what you just touched on as well, Greg. And it gets to the fact that, we on this webinar and in our community of experiential marketers, there's this huge spectrum, right, of how brands can engage with consumers. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in the next slide. But, just two notable ways that brands can build these enduring relationships with their consumers are through brand activations and brand homes that you've touched on as well. And so when we think about a brand activation, it's again, this bringing a brand to life through this, event, through an interactive experience that again can also activate the senses and touch consumers and hearts and mind. And certainly one that I'm, familiar with, that we brought into the world of Coca-Cola that's been notable since its inception in Australia in 2011, and that was Share a Coke. And that was this idea of really accelerating personalization and premiumization of the brand to engage consumers, ultimately driving sales, and acquainting people with the iconic Coca-Cola bottle. So that was, again, just a great case study behind Share a Coke. In the case of World of Coca-Cola, and of course, I'm a little familiar with that as we also think about engaging consumers. The World of Coca-Cola served as, and still serves as, a brand home. It's this kind of physical embodiment of the brand, telling the story of the company and its brands, the portfolio of brands, its history. Yet also around every corner are these curated sensorial experiences that may, again, activate taste, right? As you taste beverages from around the globe, or really elevate your scent, your sense of smell through that beverage tasting, or touch, whether that's operating a digital kiosk or it's high-fiving the iconic Coca-Cola polar bear in that case. And so those are just sort of two examples of how you can connect with consumers in both head and heart with your brand.
Fantastic. Should we move on to the next one?
Absolutely. Yeah, let's dive in. Let's dive in a little bit more. And so just building on this idea of people and leaning into people's needs for experiences. So we as brands, we can really thoughtfully intersect with people and where they are in their moments to create relevance and meaning and surprise and delight and a sense of wonder, right? All these emotions that we can architect behind these moments. So let me unpack this slide for you a little bit. And again, I think the point bears repeating that, all too well for brands, we have this overwhelming amount of choices on how we can meet people in their moments. And so if we look from left to right, we recognize that time becomes this major driver or this component of experiences. Yet it's more than time when we think about this. And so sort of the other axis of this and the other dimension to thinking about the spectrum of moments is this idea of moving from to with. So let me take you through that. So as we start with the left-hand part of the slide, when we think about print or out of home, these are more one-way communications, right? It's a snippet of time where we're communicating to consumers. Yet as we travel through time and we also expand the amount of engagement. So think about this also as an engagement model. And how we can begin to create more, again, two-way conversations or two-way experiences with consumers across, TV, and we start to increase that time with, that shopper experience in that retail environment. Social media, of course, has a broad range of time. Let's just say that that's 1 to 3 minutes. But what's also interesting as we begin to create these moments between your brand and that consumer, as they're engaging in these moments, this is not only if you're a sponsor of a concert, but you could be that venue, if you will, or you could be a pop-up retail experience. Again, there are a whole lot of things that go into these more enduring and these more expanded moments like concerts. A brand home is a very immersive experience where you can command 2+ hours with your consumers, again, giving them just this sensorial experience. And then the other thing that I just wanted to note here is kind of this idea of, regardless of whether you're a CPG brand or you're looking at a pop-up experience, never underestimate the power of relationship building with retail. And that idea that you're not just creating an opportunity for a physical souvenir that is sort of that memory of that moment and that experience, yet also an emotional souvenir. And as you think about how long that branded apparel or that branded souvenir may last around. That's also another way to think about, building these more, timely experiences. And of course, as we go from left to right, there's some major cost and investment decisions that you must make as a brand as well. So let me just kind of pause there and capture your thoughts, Greg, because you're an expert in this space.
Well, I mean, we talked a lot about this kind of stuff in the early stages of the project at Diageo in Scotland. And in a sense, it's like the degrees of transformation that can happen. And the further that you move to the right, the more that transformation really happens and where you're winning hearts and minds, as you said. And, I love that you brought up retail merchandise, because oftentimes in an experience like a brand home and even at events, the retail is the first and last impression. And if someone is willing to wear your brand, you've really won them over, right? There's a real depth there. And of course, also the best time to capture share of wallet is right after an amazing, immersive, participatory experience. So I love that retail merch is in here. I think ironically, sometimes what you see in terms of share of marketing budgets, it almost runs the opposite way. And you see sometimes, in my own personal opinion, overweighted investments and things that drive reach, but maybe not depth, maybe not the deeper engagement that you can get from some other things. Now, of course, they do provide you with that scale that can be sometimes more challenging in events, because you probably would have had, I'd say, World of Coca-Cola, much like Johnny Walker Princess Street, or you have capacity limitations. There's only so many people that you can get through, and you can't reach people everywhere around the world if they can't travel there.
Wow, it's so well said. And I really am inspired by what you just touched on. And as we go to the next slide, it really, reminds me about then, how do we create this playbook and this blueprint for, and also borrow from some best practices that we've learned around the block in experiential marketing. And so, just kind of touching on this, we're prepared today to share with everyone on our webinar kind of these 6 C's that can define ways that you can create a great experiential plan. And the first one that, Greg, you really inspired, and as we go to the next slide, it's really this idea that you just went to the heart of it, and that is clarifying your objectives are a must. Creating and marketing and measuring branded experiences, it's a challenge. And if you have disparate and misaligned objectives from the get-go, you are automatically fracturing the impact and that return on investment of your experiential marketing objective. And so here we've just identified a couple of sort of a sampling of objectives. It's not, all inclusive. Yet when you were speaking, it really just, I thought, brought home that point that you and your team, really, you were doing yourselves a favor and your consumers a favor and your bottom line a favor if you are intentional upfront with getting really clear on what is it that we aim to achieve and how are we going to measure it.
Yeah, I mean, and it doesn't always start with necessarily identifying a problem. But that can be a big driver of it. If I say, for example, go back to 2017, when the origins of Johnny Walker Princess Street came from challenges with growth in blended Scotch whiskey in particular. And Johnny Walker is the main brand in that category. It was losing share of voice to other categories of whiskey. And a lot of that fed into what we built into the design and the experience in Johnny Walker Princess Street. And of course, at the same time, the marketing comms were changing. And there's this idea of that a brand in a category that had appealed to maybe a traditional audience and occasions needed to change the thinking, appeal to younger demographics, more social occasions that you might not have in the past associated with Scotch whiskey in particular. And so a lot of this was about changing brand and category perception. So that went into the whole brand home strategy. And then, of course, once that objective was met, then we could start thinking about, okay, so maybe we need to introduce cocktails as part of the experience rather than the traditional dramming experience. But if we have people that want drams, we'll have those for them as well. We wanted to build in a sense of gamification. We wanted to build some fun surprise moments into it where people would come out and say, wow, I didn't know that about Johnny Walker. I didn't know that about Scotch whiskey, and I feel differently about the category than I did coming in. And so if, and also a lot of it in the AnyRoad world is when we're working with brands, we always ask them, what's your objective if you're running an event, if you're creating a brand home? Is it about just driving revenue for that brand home? Or are you trying to create brand change, or are you trying to create transformation? And then once you understand what that objective is, then you can start to think about how you measure it.
Wow, I love it. And again, it's just this, beautifully curated lead in and segue to our next C, if you will, and that is, if you are, if your desire is to create this experience worthy of your brand, we fundamentally must embrace this idea that everything begins and ends with your consumer. And so as we also go to the next slide, just to play that out a little bit more, it's really this cornerstone, understanding your consumer. And it's just incumbent upon us as creators of these experiences that we are going to be guided by these immersive, qualitative and quantitative and observational insights that help us understand the who, what, when, where, how of our guest experiences. And when I say that, also, it's across every aspect of their guest journey. So that's before your experience, during your experience, and then also after, as we seek to build relationships after that experiential event or moment. And so not that this should surprise anybody on our call today, but this is this idea of understanding your consumer. It's not just their demos, of course, who they are, where are they from, who's with them on the visit, who's initiating the visit, what is their relationship with you before, during, and after their visit. And I'm really keen and a big advocate for measuring that, but also, understanding what is your mix of locals versus tourists versus international guests. How are they using your experience? Is it for educational insight? Is it for just pure entertainment? Is it to tag along with the group? Is it a date night? All of these things, it's really imperative that we understand, who they are and their occasions and motivations for visiting you and for experiencing your brand, and why are they willing to give you their time in exchange for that moment? How is that going to benefit them? And so, as much as I like to geek out on research and insights, these are what I call table stakes, right? These are just foundational things that you must know. Because as intentional, Greg, as wow, that we are to build awareness, to drive consideration, and to create conversion, right? The sale and that moment of transaction for the event, there is a paradigm shift that we must embrace. And so let's talk about that a little bit more on the next slide.
Very good.
So, it's interesting when you sometimes, maybe from the outside looking in, you think, wow, even at Coca-Cola, you had these big budgets, you could, curate all of this research, and we did. But let me just share with you this one insight that changed everything. Your brand does not belong to you. Your brand belongs to your consumer. They, and as we talk about storytelling, they are the heroes in your story. And we become these faithful, these stewards of the brand to, guide them on their journey. We touched on this a little bit before, but let's play that out. And then how does this insight begin to translate? In our next slide.
Okay.
So flipping the content model, this is our third C. What does this mean? Why does it matter? How do I do it? Right? Karen, what are you talking about? Well, flipping the content model was a fundamental shift in our thinking, and it's what I'm guiding my client partners through in their own journeys. And flipping the content model matters because at the very heart of developing the best experience, the best radically compelling content that entices your consumer and your guest to visit you. It's incumbent upon you to lean into understanding, how am I going to create great content? And how am I not going to be the one that has to just imagine that content, right? And so as we go to the next slide, I can share with you that for years, we leaned into that prototypical big agency, model where we thought we kind of knew it all, right? But what happened is that we began to take this data-driven approach to understanding, how are our consumers using our brand home and our brand experience? And so let me just kind of go through a little bit of a research 101 here. And so as you step back and you look at your experience, your place, your distillery, your brand activation, your retail pop-up, across the landscape of your consumers that are engaging with you, you'll have this opportunity to create a segmentation of your guest, kind of that breakout of your guest. And in our case, we identified 7 distinctively different consumer segments, just for context. And so drilling that down, once we understand who that consumer is, and we can then begin to place a huge priority on the occasions by which they're visiting you. What's that sticky glue between your place, your experience, and your consumer? And so it could be a vacation, it could be a family reunion, it could be a date night, it could be a school field trip, just that weekend getaway or a break, during a convention, if you will. And so, it's, again, not just through your qualitative and quantitative insights, but, as you look at your team of people that are engaging with guests every day, and also as you're looking to your social media channels, right? Just as one example, you will begin to see how your guests, your consumers, are reshaping their moment through your experience. And so ultimately, I think maybe the question I want to leave you here with is, how is your brand making consumers' moments more special? And so let's go to the next slide, and I'll just kind of quickly touch on this kind of humbling moment that we had. And Greg, it was just, it was a realization that, everybody was coming into the Coca-Cola, and this year it turned 137 years young, if you will. And so whether it was that moment with, your first Coke was with your grandfather, or it was on your honeymoon, what we came to recognize is that people brought not only their human story into the place, the destination, the brand home, but they also brought their story of the brand inside the experience, creating that, again, more of a holistic experience. And so we leaned into this understanding, and we created a Moments of Happiness platform. This was not just a marketing platform, but this was, how do we not only how do we re-engineer and re-architect our creative campaigns, we also re-enabled and empowered our ambassadors to create these moments of happiness, these random, surprising moments of delight and wonder with our guests. And it also inspired the way that we created new experiences, like the Moments of Happiness film, which celebrated the consumer first and their moments, whether it was a soldier homecoming or it was an experience with family at Diwali. What we were humbly taught is that the moment was our consumers. We just happen to have the privilege of being there to make that moment, in that case, Coca-Cola, a little more special.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I think what I hear a lot around this is people participating in your brand, right? I mean, you said, like, look, your brand is not your own, and that's absolutely true. And I think also it's about getting that constant feedback loop from your consumers. I think any marketer is like, look, there's an element of, hey, I guess there could be too much data. I don't know, but a lot of it's too much data if you don't have any way to figure out the so what of the data. But that's where I think a lot of this comes in, because, how do you measure happiness? And actually you can measure it, right? There's different ways to do it, but also understanding, like, to what extent has that been created, and linking that to the specific touch points with consumers. And I think that's sort of a critical element to all this. And you've touched on a lot of this too. You want to understand where that consumer is, where that guest is before, and then what's happening while they're there, the moments of happiness, what happens at the end, and then even what are they feeling 6 months or 9 months later, right? Are they, and being able to segment them into the different groups by demographics, by new to brand versus existing customers, being able to understand people that were a little skeptical before they went in. Maybe they got dragged along to the experience and they weren't anticipating much and they came out huge fans. Important to capture all of that. And I think we've talked about a good bit of that already.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, what you touched on there too is, we talk a lot about engagement across this landscape of experiences and marketing across all of our sectors. And so, the hope here today is to provide, again, some additional inspirations and best practice about how you can not just think about engagement, but how you can measure it. And then also, how do you think about engagement across all aspects of your experience, across your people, your exhibits, your, the selling of your product. And so that's the idea. And just, building upon that, we have this opportunity in the next slide to just talk about then, I think, yeah, here we go. In the case of, this may look different for everybody that's joining us today. Yet if you're a distillery, if you are a retailer, if you're a brand home, and that's where I'm, borrowing some of these insights from, but I'm also applying this across sporting destinations and entertainment destinations that, where we have this 52 weeks of content, we used to call it feeding the content monster. And ultimately that's around creating these, not like reasons to believe, but these enticing reasons to visit and come and experience your place, if you will. And so, ultimately, whenever you're building, your plan, your experience, it's really important to start with seasonality and understanding, that seasonality across the year about when your visitors may be more inclined to visit. And so, I'll touch on this here in just a bit, but it's also important for us to think about building this calendar with what I call an earned, owned, shared, and paid model. And many of you have certainly, about this. If not, there are just tons of resources out there, and I'm happy to, partner with you as well. But as we know, across 52 weeks out of the year, we don't have an unlimited budget. At least in my case, the finance people didn't exactly think so. But we had a responsibility of driving over 1.25 million guests into the brand home. And so that's a pretty large P&L responsibility. And with so much of that, not just on the whole team and the whole experience, but on marketers' shoulders, if we go to the next slide, what we do is, we created a science, and there's so much more behind this. But again, I cannot underestimate, the power, again, with starting with your consumer at the heart of building that 52-week plan, that segmentation that we also just touched on, and knowing when international visitors are more likely to come versus locals, versus convention guests, versus military guests, and so on. But tourists, in our case, made up the most significant mix of our guest base. And so it was really incumbent upon us to know who they were, but when they were visiting. And so when you look at that seasonality and you take your flipped content model, you're going to be scaling and creating those moments of engagement, throughout the year across social media and your website, which are more, owned media, shared media opportunities. So if you are a distiller you have retail partners, how can you look at on-pack offers? You may have customers. In the case of World of Coca-Cola, Delta is a major airline partner. And so that presented us with an opportunity to look at bartered media to connect with international consumers during the time that we knew that we needed to influence their visitation. And so it's also important that you get really intentional of getting really gritty and getting really creative. Honestly, as a brand, World of Coca-Cola was one of the smallest brands in the portfolio, and we had to think like a startup. We had to get really, really crafty and really, really creative to create those compelling reasons to visit across the year. And this is also what I see and share with client partners that are also looking to stretch those opportunities to connect with their guests.
Yeah, and I love this calendar because this is where we started out talking a lot about the why behind experiential marketing, or sometimes as you refer to it, destination marketing, which I like too. And this is where you start to get into the how. And of course, in an hour, we're not going to get into the details around that, but hopefully it plants some ideas. And, I see that when you start getting into this kind of context, you can start to visualize, like, how could I use a calendar and the different events and things that I'm doing to, like, connect my brand to the community, for an example. How would I use it to create positive associations with other brands or events and other things, right? I mean, you see this whether it's at brand homes and things that are happening in that city. And it's also true for activations and such that are, like, tying into what's happening at a festival or an event, like in a third space, where they're bringing themselves in and they're creating this environment around the brand that makes people think differently around it. And so I think that's where, and one of the first questions that we often ask our customers when they're, like, thinking about how to drive activations using our solution is what's your activation calendar? What are you doing? When are you doing it? What are your objectives? Who are your target audiences, and what behaviors do you want to change or influence as a result of that? So there's a lot to work with here, and we could probably spend the whole hour talking about the one calendar here, or I'm sure you could. So
Well,
good.
I think this word that I continue to use is intentionality, and or substitute that for strategic, but it's around getting really, really clear up front versus just, I hate to say it, but I see so often brands kind of fall victim to the next shiny object or the latest TikTok video or influencer craze. And those are important. I don't want to be dismissive of them, but I think, you ultimately have to think about, all right, what is that destination? No pun intended. Where are we aiming? And, behind this calendar, and then also really baked into our next slide is, what are those metrics behind, the calendar? So just uniquely enough, behind every one of those 52 weeks was, in our case, an attendance forecast, a revenue forecast, a retail conversion forecast, right? There were some really hard metrics behind each of those. So it's not just a pretty slide. It was one that was really, again, intended to drive performance, not just marketing or an experience for marketing and experience's sake. And so the kind of the 6C that I wanted just to, spend just a teeny bit of time on is really thinking about this idea that we have as stewards of the brand. I keep talking about that, but I learned that it's just fundamentally important. And it's, we have this, not only this role, but we have this responsibility not to just drive short-term results. Yet we also have this opportunity to continually invent and reinvest and find new ways to create long-term value and more moments, right, for our guests to experience down the road. And so I also believe, and this was a Coca-Cola initiative that we quickly locked into, and that's sometimes the best thinking can come from looking outside of your industry. And in this case, we look to Google and their innovation model. It's called the 70-20-10 model. You can look it up. But we look to it to help us almost create this sort of segmentation and this model for innovation. But it also helped give us a framework for how we started thinking about our initiatives and where we were going to be placing our big bets, but also how are we going to hold ourselves accountable to innovating for the future. And so it kind of works like this. 70% of your initiatives are intentionally focused on kind of this bread and butter, that core experience and those drivers. And, for us in that case, this was that paid daily ticketed experience, right? That daily admission, option for our guest. The next 20% are taking those kind of core drivers, those core bread and butter drivers that are adding value to your business, but tweaking them, adding on to them, making them more special year over year. And an example of this for us was then looking at creating VIP experiences that were more immersive, more personalized, more premium. So that's just one example of that. And then this idea of this innovation model, it tends to work best in those companies and those cultures that really truly do embrace innovation and a spirit of what if, a spirit of risk taking that's failure free, where you're promoting that idea of taking risks, but not suffering if things fail. And so in this case, this 10% is also really important. And in our case, we tested out these private ticketed experiences. One such example was, Coke with Meals was a major platform for the brand. And we architected these experiences with 3 celebrity chefs that were intended to help us reach different audiences. But where we had chefs create this beautiful demonstration in a private theater. And then afterwards, guests were released into the World of Coca-Cola, where they got to sample each and every one of those chefs' creations. And so I share that with you just as an example of how you can possibly think about, if you're struggling with how do I kind of break out my initiatives, how do I think about creating a framework for my budget, this might be a starting point for you.
Good. Great. Before we jump into the audience Q&A, actually a question, since we're on a budgeting slide, for you, Karen, what advice do you have for brands maybe that don't have the resources of a Coca-Cola or a Johnny Walker in terms of getting investment for experiential marketing? And we can talk about brand homes, or we can talk about brand activations, either one. I just was curious as to what advice you had, because I mean, you said your finance department was always challenging, and we had the same thing in Diageo. We were never given a blank check. However, there would be typically more resources at your disposal than a lot of the brands that we work with.
I love and appreciate this question, because I can't help but just also think about some of the best and most memorable, startup brands where we can learn, lessons from. And so one of my favorite examples is one here from Atlanta. It's called King of Pops. And King of Pops started out, I believe, in like 2012, 2013. And literally the owner was creating his own gourmet popsicles every day. He was curating the ingredients, these, again, kind of wholesome gourmet, for lack of a better phrase, popsicles. And he started selling them on a street corner in Atlanta with a used ice cream cart, an umbrella, a chalkboard stand, and himself. And it's interesting, but the product caught on because it was again sort of this wholesome gourmet treat. But as they now brand themselves as more than a tasty dessert, what the brand did as it began to scale, as it started to intentionally immerse themselves into local culture. And so they started, again, creating pop-ups in festivals and events and in neighborhoods. And they then began a franchise model, and then they licensed it out to what they call cartrepreneurs. But it was the power of the people behind this, franchise model. And think about, this was very small at the time, that they leaned in and they listened to where they could also then begin to scale. And so over time, they began to grow in coffee shops and now are in grocery stores. But they also began to create these connections with caterers and started becoming a tasty, fun treat at weddings and bar mitzvahs. Ultimately now, they have also expanded into larger mixed-use developments like the Battery, which is this, again, entertainment district where the Atlanta Braves play. Still taking their cart, their umbrella, and their chalkboard sign. But they now have over 500 flavors, but they've also, again, leaning in and listening to their consumers, they have created a pop-up bar in several iconic locations in order to attract their target consumer, creating experiences like pop tails, where you can order your favorite cocktail and your favorite round of popsicles and King of Pops for your friends. They've also expanded into dog treats. You can also rent out their headquarters. So I share with their story with you because they started small, but they've retained their authenticity. And they started off with under $2,000. And so it's possible to get really clear with your brand. Who do you serve? What experience do you want to create? And then listen to your consumers, and then begin to immerse yourself in culture in just very gritty startup kind of ways. I hope that example helps, but look them up. And if you follow them on Instagram, I love it. They call themselves an entrepreneur. That's how they brand themselves. Pretty cute.
Love it. Great story. All right. We are on to questions from the audience. And we had a couple that have come in, but keep them coming. We have a few minutes left to be able to get through them. First one that I have, I think it's a good one for you, Karen. As a destination marketer, how do you balance the need to drive guest visits while also growing long-term brand loyalty? And it kind of leads into a second question that I'll take.
Ooh, that is one of those big strategic questions, and maybe kind of two ways to sort of skin that cat, if you will. I'm a fan of the phrase, you get what you measure. And it also goes back to that setting those, intentions and those clear objectives. Again, the World of Coca-Cola example was that we were responsible for sort of these dual objectives. And one was, of course, the P&L that I noted, and the other one was serving as a strategic marketing asset, ultimately creating an experience that built and changed perceptions of the brand and the company's brands in order to inspire future consumption, greater likelihood, recommend to visit, recommend to consume beverages. And so we were very intentional in measuring that as a result of the experience. And so what I might also offer up to our guests today is, touch a little bit on your guest journey and that transformational journey that you're creating. And that leans into this idea of before the visit, engaging with your consumers during the experience, but then also that post-visit experience. And so what I would just encourage you to do is to, capture through your research. So capturing guest emails or phone numbers as part of that ticketing process, or as part of those, iPad surveys that you may be doing, capturing their data and insights as part of that retail experience in order to continue to build and nourish that relationship with them after their visit. And in our case, going back to, again, I'm sorry, another World of Coca-Cola example was recognizing that we began to extract locals versus tourists. And we knew that during those non-peak seasons, we wanted to invite our locals to come more often. And we also knew that value was important to them. So it inspired us to take actions to create offers that were really relevant for them, to bring friends and family, and to also, find new reasons to come and experience the attraction.
Great, good answer. So the other question, you'll see it is very closely connected to what we just talked about. In your experience from a brand standpoint, how do you try and measure loyalty as opposed to concrete bottom line sales? And what metrics would you look at? And this question was asked in the context of someone that did a luxury driving experience, which completely made them fans of the brand, but they might not purchase that until 3-5 years later, compared to, say, like a whiskey experience where you can have the immediacy of buying a bottle post-tour, post-experience. And I think, I love this question because actually most of the brands that we work with, they don't control their own distribution. And so they will spend a lot of money to go out and measure brand health, brand awareness out there in the world. But what they're not necessarily capturing, if they are investing in experiential activities, is what did that specific event or that specific brand home or that particular visit do in terms of driving behavior. And if the purchase cycle is 3 to 5 years, then that's also probably when you want to be asking the question later on. Now, it starts with what you mentioned is, getting the consumer to share their data up front, getting them to opt in to your marketing messages. There's we know that the ROI is higher on experiential marketing than on all other forms of marketing. We also know that people who come into a brand as a new customer via experiential are spending a lot more with the brand. And so it's capturing that data beforehand. And then we ask them, right? That's the simple thing. We ask them about their purchase intention post-experience. And if it's a 3 to 5 year cycle, come back and ask them 3 to 5 years down the road. If you have their data and information and you have some kind of, link into, in the case of automotives, dealers, which I know is usually a challenge, you may lose that trail, but at least you should be able to, through the information that you're gathering from the people that do those driving experiences in that example, you should be able to get a good sense of what the lifetime value is of that customer and the ROI of delivering those experiences. Because I know the driving experiences don't necessarily turn profits and aren't always run as P&Ls in the same way that a brand home is. So you have to look at other metrics like that. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Wow, you did an extraordinary job of again, answering it, but also framing the importance of being intentional on capturing that guest information and measuring. Again, it's what do you want to measure? It all ladders back up to your objectives. And in the case of loyalty, I look at that also as building an enduring relationship. And so having that guest information allows you then these multiple options, to whether it's through email marketing, it's through phone calls, it's through building the relationship. And in the case of your driving example, recognizing that that's a longer lead type of sale, it's more of a complex, sales funnel almost, if you will. And that's around looking at what are those experiences that you want to architect that ultimately ladder up to and influence that purchase. Loyalty is absolutely critical, and brands, are faced with numerous challenges in, creating loyalty. We have to earn that each and every day. But I think in the case of what you just described, Greg, it's being intentional and understanding who your consumer is, identifying those actions that are going to really carefully, support your ability to build that enduring relationship with them before, during, and after their visit. And, I think, it also ticks and ties back to how you opened up our call today. And that is that experiential marketing is an art and a science. It is both the fun aspects of content creation, but also those more left-brained, exercises that help us measure the impact of winning hearts and minds.
Yeah. I mean, as marketers are always fighting for budget, right? You're fighting, if you're doing a brand home project, you're fighting for CapEx. If you're a marketer, you're fighting for A&P, and the more data you have and the more that you can prove what you're getting out of it, the more budget you're going to get. And that's why historically digital marketers have been an advantage, because they have more data. And of course, we're trying to change that whole approach.
Absolutely.
I have one last question. I think we're out of time after that. What advice do you have for brands looking to influence the agencies they work with to embrace different measurement approaches? So as an example, measuring effectiveness metrics like new customer acquisition and lifetime value, in addition to more efficiency metrics like sampling or cost per contact.
Wow, it's a big question. And, it's sort of an extension of that significance that we talked about around not just clarifying your objectives, but, for that marketer and the agency partnership, right? Those are absolutely, it's such a critical relationship, and it's one that's deserving of aligned objectives. And so I think that, part of that agency selection process is also being really clear. I don't, love that RFP, mindset, if you will, but ensuring that your agency partners are going to collaborate with you and join together on if it's not just the creation of those joint objectives, but it's the fact that your agency partners are going to be aligned against that. What is the North Star that you're setting for your brand and your branded experience? Again, holding each other accountable to how you're going to set up those metrics, how you're going to perform those metrics, how do you share them? But then also that post-event recap of looking at how are we going to use this insight to create actions that are going to help improve that experience for the next city or the next distillery or the next moment that you're going to create. And I think that, it's interesting. Again, if you have misaligned objectives up front, you are already fracturing, that guest experience because you're all focused on, separate things. And so, to the degree also that as agencies and brands are trying new metrics for the first time, I think it's also important to test and adjust, start to test against those objectives and measure them, and then use those again to create new actions for the future. That's really all. Again, like you said earlier, it's a topic we could talk about at length, but those are just some introductory thoughts. Great question.
Yeah, I mean, I would even add in, getting involved in the briefing process and being, as say the brand owner, being clear about what you want to measure for your events, let's say, or your experiences, and working with the agency as a partner. And then, I mean, that's the thing. If they're not willing to do it, then challenge them, right? I mean, they're working for you, so encourage them to share this data. And when we talk about it as like, rather than just sticking to the one-dimensional metrics that don't really tell you whether or not you've changed brand salience or brand perception, or whether you've influenced future purchase behavior, look for the three-dimensional so that you can really measure it in a more broad way.
Wonderful.
We are at the close, and so I want to leave up a couple of QR codes. We'd love to hear from you. The QR code on the left, so please give us feedback on this webinar, and you here as well if you'd like to get in touch with Karen, talk to her about what she does. She can probably help you if you're on this webinar. This is her contact information. We hope you've enjoyed the summit. Thank you very much for joining, and hope to talk to you all soon.
Thank you.